He thought he was done being a father, until one knock on a winter night changed everything. If stories of second chances and unexpected family move your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. What happens next might just stay with you longer than you expect. The wind howled against the eaves like a hungry animal, clawing through the pine trees and rattling the corners of the old cabin. Thomas stood at the stove, ladling reheated soup into a chipped ceramic bowl. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, and the fire popped in the hearth behind him. It was the coldest night of the season so far, and the snow outside had been falling in relentless waves since early afternoon. He took his bowl to the worn table by the window, where a single place setting waited. He ate slowly, mechanically, like a man chewing time instead of food. No music played, no television hummed in the background. Silence had become his only familiar companion. Ever since the fire, ever since Ellie and Jenna. He didn't let himself think about it, not usually. But winter had a way of pressing against old scars, reminding you of everything you used to hold, especially on nights like this when even the heat inside felt borrowed. Thomas had just rinsed his bowl in the sink and stirred the fire when he heard it. A knock. Not loud, not hurried, just deliberate. He froze. No one came out here without calling first, not this late, not in a blizzard. He crossed to the door cautiously, boots heavy on the wooden floor. The second knock came just as his hand touched the handle, slightly firmer this time but still restrained, like someone unsure if they were allowed to ask for help. When he opened it, the wind rushed in first, a wall of icy air curling into the house. And then he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 16. Soaked through, her jeans stiff with snow, the thin gray hoodie clinging to her arms. No gloves, no hat. Her hair was wet and plastered to her cheeks, which were pale except for the fierce flush of cold. She didn't say anything, didn't even flinch, just stood there, eyes wide, lips trembling. A cheap backpack clutched to her chest like a life raft. Thomas blinked, stunned. His first instinct was caution. The second, memory. Ellie would have been her age now, if she'd lived. He shook the thought away and focused on the girl. She looked like she'd been out there a long time. "You can't stay out in that," he said, voice rough from disuse. Still, she said nothing. Just stared at him like he might disappear if she blinked. He hesitated. His body blocked most of the warmth inside. All it would take was one breath and she'd vanish into the woods again, maybe freeze before sunrise. Maybe no one would find her. He stepped aside. "Come in," he said quietly. "You'll freeze out there." She moved like a deer, half expecting a trap, but crossed the threshold nonetheless. Snow dripped from her sleeves onto the floor. She didn't remove her shoes, didn't speak, didn't look around. Just stood near the fire trying to keep from shaking. Thomas closed the door gently behind her. The wind rattled once, then moved on. He walked to the hallway closet and pulled out an old flannel blanket. When he returned, she was still standing like a statue, arms tightly wrapped around her pack. "Here," he said, holding out the blanket. "Dry off some." She didn't move. Thomas waited a moment, then set the blanket on the back of the couch and stepped away. The fire crackled. The girl edged closer to it. "I've got soup," he offered. "If you're hungry." She glanced up. Her lips parted, like she wanted to say something, but whatever it was, she swallowed it. She nodded once. He moved back to the stove and poured a second bowl, heating it quickly, adding a pinch of salt and a little cracked pepper. He found a clean spoon. When he handed it to her, she took it with both hands, as if it might break. She sat on the edge of the couch, bowl cupped between her palms, shoulders hunched as if still expecting a blow from some invisible corner. Thomas didn't ask questions. Not yet. He watched her out of the corner of his eye as he stirred the fire, adjusted the logs. Her eyes were heavy-lidded, her knuckles red and raw. There were bruises beneath her sleeves, old or new, he couldn't tell. But something about her posture told him everything he needed to know. This was a child who had learned not to trust kindness, who'd learned to run before asking. He returned to the chair across from her and sat quietly. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was protective, necessary. When she finished the soup, she looked up again. Her voice, when it came, was small and scratchy, barely more than breath. "Thank you." Thomas nodded once. "You can sleep here," he said. "The couch is yours for tonight." She didn't reply, but her eyes, still rimmed with fear, softened just slightly. He handed her the blanket. "Get some rest." He turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the soft glow of the fire to fill the room. As he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, he paused halfway up and looked back. She was curled on the couch now, legs tucked up beneath her, the blanket pulled to her chin. She wasn't asleep. Just watching the flames like they might turn into something else, like they might become safe. Outside, the snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, erasing the footprints on the porch, erasing everything, and Thomas, standing there in the dark, felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not warmth, not yet, but something like thaw, something like the beginning of spring in the dead of winter. He turned away, unaware that downstairs the girl had begun to cry, silently, into the crook of her elbow. Not from fear, not from cold, but because someone had opened a door and let her in. Morning came slowly. The storm had dulled to a hush, its fury now packed into snowdrifts pressed against the cabin windows. Pale light seeped through the frosted glass, stretching long shadows across the wooden floor. The hearth still crackled faintly, barely embers now. Thomas stood in the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, watching the girl on the couch. She hadn't moved much through the night. Still curled beneath the flannel blanket, her damp hair now a tangled halo against the pillow. Her backpack rested on the floor, one strap looped tightly around her wrist, like a tether or a warning. He sipped the coffee. Bitter, lukewarm, just like every other morning. But today there was a stranger in his living room, and somehow that felt worse. And better. She stirred as he turned to pour another cup. Her eyes blinked open slowly, as if waking was something she hadn't expected. To survive, Thomas didn't speak. Just nodded once and returned to the stove. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her voice still dry, like gravel in the throat. "I'll go soon." He paused, back to her. "You don't have to leave yet," he said quietly. "Not in this cold." She sat up slowly, wincing as she shifted. "I don't want to be a problem." Thomas turned, facing her fully. "You're not." The girl looked down at her hands, chapped, pale, twitching slightly. She pulled the blanket tighter. He set a clean mug on the table beside her. "Coffee?" She shook her head. "Too bitter." He half smiled. "Smart." For a while they just sat there, her on the couch, him in the kitchen. Two people pretending the house wasn't full of things they weren't ready to say. Finally, Thomas broke the quiet. "You got a name?" She hesitated. "Grace." It came out like a confession, not a fact. He nodded. "I'm Thomas." Grace gave a small nod, but didn't repeat it. "Where are you from?" he asked, gently, beat. "Nowhere important." He didn't push, just nodded again. Grace stood slowly, her movements cautious, as if waiting for permission that never came from anyone before. "Do you have a bathroom?" He pointed down the hall. When she disappeared, Thomas let out the breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The house still smelled faintly of smoke, not from the fire in the hearth, but from years ago, embedded in the bones of the place. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, he could still smell the old cedar crib, still hear the echo of Ellie's laugh from the upstairs hallway. He didn't let people in anymore. Not since the night he carried Jenna's body out of that house with his shirt torn and his hands burned, and the sound of sirens drowning out everything he thought mattered. Not until last night. Not until Grace. She came back into the room a few minutes later, her hair wet where she'd splashed water on her face. Her expression had softened, but her shoulders were still drawn up, guarded. He was seated now, across the room from her, in the same armchair he always sat in. The one Jenna used to tease him about, calling it his grump throne. Grace looked around the living room. Her eyes caught on the wall above the fireplace and a row of photos. She stood and approached them. A younger Thomas smiled from one frame, arms wrapped around a bright-eyed woman with auburn hair. Another showed a little girl with a missing front tooth holding a puppy in a red scarf. Grace stared at the photos a long time. "Your family?" Thomas nodded slowly. "My wife. My daughter. Long time ago." Grace didn't speak, didn't say sorry, just stood there, hands at her sides. "They were beautiful," she said finally. "They were everything," he replied. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like acknowledgement, like standing beside someone else's grave and understanding, without words, that you both lost something that can't be named. Grace stepped away from the photos and sank back onto the couch. She stared into the fire. Thomas cleared his throat. "I've got some leftover biscuits, scrambled eggs too if you want." She nodded. "Please." They ate at opposite ends of the small wooden table. Thomas noticed how Grace picked at her food, chewing slowly, watching the window as if expecting someone to burst in and drag her away. He didn't ask who. Not yet. After breakfast, she helped him wash the dishes without being asked. It struck him. How quietly she moved. How she always kept the counter between them like a wall she couldn't afford to take down. He tried not to think about how familiar it all felt. The way Jenna used to hum while drying plates. How Ellie used to sneak sips of orange juice while standing on tiptoe. Now it was just him and her, a stranger. No, a girl with no place to go. "Do you have school?" he asked, drying a mug. She paused. "Not anymore." He didn't push. Instead, he looked out the window. Snow still blanketed everything. The road would be impassable for another day or two, maybe more. He wasn't sure if he hoped it would clear or not. He cleared his throat again. "You can stay. At least until the weather breaks." Grace's head snapped up. She looked at him, really looked. And for a moment, he saw it. The flicker of relief, instantly smothered by doubt. "Why?" she asked, and her voice was so soft, he barely heard her. Thomas considered the question. "Because it's what Ellie would have wanted? Because no one else is coming for you? Because I'm tired of eating alone?" He didn't say any of that. Instead, he looked her in the eyes and answered simply, "Because no one deserves to be out there in the cold." Grace didn't respond. But she didn't argue either, and for now, that was enough. That night, after Grace had curled back onto the couch and the fire had been fed and dimmed, Thomas stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room. The snow outside made everything glow faintly, blue and silver and quiet. He watched her sleeping form, the way her hand still gripped her backpack, the way her breath hitched, every so often like her body hadn't quite learned to rest. And he wondered, not for the first time, if bringing her in had been an act of compassion or weakness. Then again, maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the difference between the two was just a door and whether you chose to open it. The snow didn't let up for 2 more days. Thomas woke each morning to a world bleached white. The porch, buried, the trees sagging under soft weight, the road into town little more than a suggestion beneath the drifts. Inside, the house felt warmer than it had in years. Not in temperature, the fire had always kept the chill at bay, but in something else, something less measurable. Grace didn't talk much, but she stayed. She ate the meals he cooked, folded blankets without being asked, and helped stack the firewood with a quiet diligence that unsettled him in its familiarity. Sometimes he'd glance up from the sink or the workbench to find her gazing at nothing, eyes glazed, fingers twitching near her sleeves, as if trying to remember how to stay inside her own skin. He recognized that look. He'd worn it for years. They didn't talk about why she was here. Not yet. He didn't ask, and she didn't offer. It was an unspoken agreement, a pact forged in silence. I won't touch your wounds if you don't touch mine. But every day she stayed, the weight in Thomas's chest shifted. Not lighter, just different, like something beginning to stir beneath long-settled ash. It was Grace who brought it up on the third night. They were sitting in the living room after dinner, Thomas with a book, unread in his lap, and Grace with a worn composition, notebook open on her knees. She didn't write in it, just held it, thumbing the edges as if it might anchor her to the moment. She looked up suddenly, voice softer than the firelight. Is that room upstairs? The one with the yellow door? Was it hers? Thomas didn't need to ask who she meant. He set the book aside. Yeah, he said after a pause. That was Ellie's. Grace nodded, eyes dipping back to her notebook. It feels full. Thomas almost smiled. It was, always, even when she wasn't in it. Grace didn't say anything for a while, then, almost too quiet. Could I maybe sleep there instead of the couch? Thomas blinked. It wasn't what he expected. He searched her face for mockery, for intrusion, but saw none. Just a girl asking for a door to be opened that she had no right to knock on. But, still did, he exhaled. It hasn't been touched in a long time. I won't mess anything up. I know, he said. He stood. Come on. The hallway upstairs creaked with memory. Every floorboard seemed to hold a whisper, Ellie's bare feet, Jenna's laughter, the ghost of a bedtime song sung off-key. Thomas hadn't opened the yellow door in nearly 5 years. His hand hesitated on the knob, knuckles pale. Grace stood behind him, quiet as falling snow. He turned the handle. The room was small, just 10 feet by 10, but it held more than square footage. A narrow bed sat under the window, its quilt still, folded neatly across the footboard, soft pink with stars handmade by Jenna's mother. A bookshelf leaned against the wall, still lined with middle-grade novels and a few dog-eared fairy tales. A pair of ballet slippers hung on the closet door by their ribbons, dusty but untouched. The air smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. Grace stepped in slowly as if entering a chapel. She ran her fingers gently across the bookshelf, pausing at a photo in a silver frame. A gap-toothed girl with wide eyes, holding a snow globe in her mittened hands. She looks happy, Grace whispered. She was. Grace moved toward the window. It looked out over the backyard where a bare-limbed tree stood beneath the moonlight. Its branches were gnarled but sturdy. The old apple tree. The one Ellie used to call her Promise Tree. Why that name? Grace asked, still looking outside. Thomas leaned on the doorframe. She said if we ever argued or if anything ever felt broken, we'd meet under that tree and start over. Grace turned to him, something unreadable in her face. Did you? He swallowed. I didn't get the chance. The silence between them wasn't painful this time, it was sacred. I can sleep on the floor, Grace said. Just being here feels safe. You can use the bed, he said, before he could stop himself. It should be used again. She looked at him, startled. Are you sure? No one else ever will. Later that night, after Grace had retreated into Ellie's room, now hers, though not quite, Thomas sat alone by the fire, staring at the empty couch she used to sleep on. A cup of tea cooled in his hand, untouched. He didn't know why he said yes, why he let her in, why he opened that door, the one he had avoided for years, and invited her into the most fragile corner of his past. Maybe it was how she looked at that room, not with entitlement, but reverence. Maybe it was how gently she touched the bookshelf as if it might breathe, or maybe it was something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to name. He looked toward the stairs, imagining her curled under the pink quilt, watching the snow fall from the same window Ellie used to press her nose against. He didn't believe in reincarnation. Didn't believe in second chances either, but something about this felt like both. Not a replacement, not a healing, just a beginning. He rose slowly, joints creaking, and walked to the back door. He opened it. stepping out into the cold, boots crunching softly. The apple tree stood there, the snow piled high around its roots. He stared at it for a long time. "I didn't forget," he murmured, voice hoarse with frost and memory. He looked up to the window above, light glowing behind yellow curtains, and whispered to the dark, "She found me first, Elle. Thomas found the letter by accident." It was early, just after sunrise, and the house was still hushed in the way it always was before the fire fully caught and the coffee kicked in. The kind of hush that felt earned. Outside, the snow had finally stopped, and the pine trees hung heavy and glassy with ice. He climbed the stairs with a folded quilt in his arms, meaning to lay it at the foot of the bed in Ellie's room. Grace's room now, he supposed, just to make it warmer. She'd been quiet again the last day or two, more than usual. Something in her shoulders had curled back inward, like she was holding her breath against something old. The door was slightly ajar. She wasn't there. He could hear water running faintly. The shower. He hesitated, then stepped inside. The room hadn't changed much. A few books had moved on the shelf. Her backpack now rested in the corner, frayed and sagging. The pink quilt was rumpled from sleep. A sketch sat on the desk, a small pencil drawing of the apple tree. Grace had a careful hand, almost reverent. He smiled softly, about to lay the new quilt down, when something fluttered from the edge of the notebook on the desk. A torn envelope, creased and smudged, folded around a single page. He didn't mean to look, but he did. The handwriting was uneven, like someone fighting the urge to give up halfway through every line. "Dear Mom, I didn't leave to hurt you. I left because you stopped seeing me. You looked through me like I was a problem you'd forgotten to lock away. You said I brought shame, that I broke everything. Maybe I did. But I didn't ask for what happened. I didn't ask for him to touch me like that. And when I finally told you, when I finally said it out loud, all you said was, you always did want attention. I stopped being your daughter the moment you chose silence. I don't know who I am now. I don't know if I'm worth anything, but I'm not going back. Not ever." Grace Thomas stood still, the letter trembling in his hand. The edges were worn, like it had been folded and unfolded a dozen times, like the words had been written as much for survival as for release. A cold settled into his spine. Not the kind that came from winter, but the kind that came from knowledge you could never unknow. He sat slowly on the edge of the bed, the letter still open. He thought of the way Grace flinched when someone walked too fast near her. The way she always kept a wall between them, not just furniture, but something deeper. The way she never touched the photos, only looked. She hadn't run from a bad night. She'd run from a world that pretended not to hear her. Thomas didn't realize his hands were shaking until the letter fluttered to the floor. The shower stopped. Minute later, soft footsteps padded down the hallway. Thomas stood quickly, gently setting the letter back where he'd found it. He wasn't proud of reading it, but he also knew sometimes the things we're not ready to say are the very things that need to be heard. Grace appeared in the doorway, hair damp, sleeves tugged over her palms. She froze. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Sharp. "Bear, I was just leaving a blanket," he said quietly. She nodded, said nothing. Thomas moved past her, then stopped. Turned. He didn't mention the letter. Instead, he spoke slowly, each word shaped by care. "You know, my daughter Ellie. She used to write letters too. Never sent them. Just kept them in a box under her bed. Said sometimes writing things down made them more real than saying them." Grace didn't look at him, but she didn't leave either, he continued. "She used to think being quiet meant being strong. I didn't correct her. I wish I had." Grace's chin dipped slightly. Thomas's voice dropped to something gentler than she'd ever heard from him. "You don't have to be silent to be safe, Grace." That broke something. Her breath hitched in a soft, involuntary sound, and her arms wrapped around herself like armor. "I didn't mean to stay this long," she whispered. "I know. I was just going to sleep here one night, then go, he nodded. You still can. Or you can stay longer. It's your call. Her throat worked hard to swallow the words, trying to escape. It's not just me, she said finally. I know, he said again. This time softer. She looked up then, and for the first time since she'd walked through his door, she didn't look like a shadow trying not to be seen. She looked like someone desperately hoping not to be turned away. I'm not asking for anything, she said. I didn't have anywhere else. Thomas held her gaze, steady. You don't need to ask, he said. Not anymore. That night, Thomas brought the old cedar box down from the attic. He placed it on the mantel beside the fire. Inside were letters Ellie had written, some addressed to future me, others to her mother, a few to no one at all. He hadn't opened them in years. Grace saw the box, said nothing, but her eyes softened every time she passed it. And when she went upstairs that night, she paused on the landing and turned back. Thank you, she said. Just that. Thomas nodded. But long after the fire dimmed and Grace had disappeared into Ellie's room, Thomas sat by the hearth staring at the box. 2 daughters, one lost to flame, one lost to silence, and maybe, just maybe, one finally, quietly found. The snow kept falling, but somehow the house grew warmer, not in temperature, though the fire now seemed to burn longer each night, but in presence, in laughter, however soft, in movement, in the sound of someone else in the kitchen, not rushing, not intruding, just there. Grace settled in, not all at once, but like snow melting on a rooftop. Quiet, gradual, uneven. She never asked to stay longer. She simply didn't leave. And Thomas didn't ask why. She began helping with things around the cabin, feeding the fire, folding laundry, chopping vegetables for dinner. She moved lightly as if afraid to leave a mark. But Thomas noticed how she opened the curtains each morning to let the light in, how she began to hum, barely, when washing dishes, how her voice no longer caught in her throat every time he spoke to her. It was during one of those quiet evenings, the kind where time felt stitched together by small gestures, that she stood near the back window and asked, "What kind of tree is that?" Thomas looked up from the workbench where he was sanding a broken chair leg. He followed her gaze. "The apple tree," he said. "Used to be, anyway." "It's beautiful," she murmured. "It used to bloom white every spring." Ellie called. "Hit her promise tree. Said whenever things got hard, that's where we'd meet. Start fresh." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then, almost shyly, she asked, "Could we plant something?" Thomas paused. The question caught him off guard. "You mean now? In the snow?" she added quickly. "No, not now. Just maybe, when it gets warmer." He looked at her, really looked, and saw what she wasn't saying. She wanted a reason to still be here when the snow melted. He nodded. "We'll plant something together. You pick it." Her smile was small, but real. "Okay." A few days later, Thomas found her in the living room, crouched beside the hearth, staring at the wooden box of letters he'd placed there. He cleared his throat softly. "You can open it, if you want." Grace looked up, startled. "No, I shouldn't. They're hers. They're meant to be read," he said. Ellie would have wanted someone to hear her. Grace hesitated, then opened the lid slowly, like it might bite. She thumbed through the envelopes, reading the first lines without fully unfolding them. Then she paused, looked over her shoulder. "Did she ever write to you?" Thomas leaned on the doorway, arms crossed loosely. "Only once." "Did you read it?" "Not yet." "Why not?" He looked down. "Maybe I was scared I wouldn't be the father she remembered." Grace closed the box gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are." Thomas blinked. She stood and turned away quickly, but the words lingered, hanging in the room like smoke that wouldn't lift. One night, not long after, he brought down an old piece of pine wood from the shed. rough, cracked at the edge but sturdy. Grace sat nearby, scribbling in her notebook, legs tucked under her like a child pretending not to watch. Thomas ran his hand across the surface, then picked up a chisel. "What are you carving?" she asked. He looked at her over his shoulder. "Something for your door." "My door?" He gave a soft shrug. "Figure it's about time your name was on something." The next evening, he knocked gently before entering her room. She was sitting on the bed, book open, light dim. He held out the small wooden plaque. Grace's room, etched in careful, clean letters. Nothing fancy, just honest. She held it like it was breakable. "You made this?" He nodded. "I've never had something like this before." He leaned on the door frame. "Everyone should have. A door with their name on it." Grace stared at the sign for a long moment, then whispered, "Thank you." There were tears in her voice, but not in her eyes. Not yet. They planted a seedling 2 weeks later. It was a ridiculous idea. The ground was frozen, the forecast still grim. But Grace insisted. "We'll dig through the snow just enough to start. It'll know when to grow." Thomas grumbled about frostbite but helped anyway. They chose a spot beside the old apple tree, near where Ellie used to stack rocks and call it her treasure wall. The sapling was small, just a bare-limbed branch in a burlap sack. But Grace cradled it like something holy. They dug a shallow hole together, their hands pink with cold. Grace pressed the roots into the earth. Thomas packed the dirt around it, slow and firm. They stood there afterward, silent. "She'll have a sister," Grace said softly. Thomas turned to her, brow lifted. Grace looked at the tree. "My baby." Thomas didn't speak, just reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder. It was the first time she'd said it aloud, and neither of them flinched. That night, Thomas passed by the living room on his way to bed and saw her sitting, cross-legged by the fire again, notebook open. She was writing. Her pen moved slowly with purpose. She didn't notice him. But when she was done, she folded the page carefully, walked to the wooden box and placed it inside, between Ellie's letters. Thomas stepped back, heart full of something too large to name. She hadn't just added a letter, she'd added herself. And in that quiet house on a frozen hill under a sky full of winter stars, Thomas finally understood. Healing didn't come with fireworks or fanfare. It came in flannel blankets and carved wooden names, in hot soup and shared silence, in the planting of something, small, fragile, foolish, and full of promise. The snow had finally begun to recede, not by much, just a soft crust melting along the porch railings, a shift in the wind that didn't bite as deep. But it was enough for the road into town to reopen, for neighbors to begin emerging from their shuttered homes with mail in hand and salt buckets rattling against their thighs. Thomas didn't leave the house often. Not anymore. He had what he needed: firewood, flour, a kettle that still whistled. Grace had learned the rhythm of the place, when to stoke the fire, how much to stir the stew, which chair in the corner creaked if you shifted your weight wrong. He'd almost allowed himself to believe it could last, that this quiet they'd built was too humble to be noticed by the outside world, but the outside always found a way in. It was a Thursday afternoon when the first knock came, not at their door, but at the gas station at the edge of town. Sheriff. Brant stopped by later that day, chewing sunflower seeds like he always had. He leaned against the porch rail and gave Thomas a look that was neither friendly nor harsh. "Just tired. Got someone asking about a teenage girl," Brant said. "Runaway. Said her name might be Grace." Thomas's jaw tightened. Guy looked out of place, the sheriff added. "Clean shoes, big truck, asking too many questions in a town that doesn't much like strangers." Thomas kept his voice calm. "You give him anything?" Brant shook his head. "Said I hadn't seen anyone, which, as of now, is still technically true." They stood in silence. "You want to tell me anything?" Brant asked finally. Thomas's eyes shifted toward the window where Grace's silhouette could be seen in the kitchen, drying a plate slowly, her posture stiff, her head low. "She's safe here," Thomas said. Brant nodded once. "That's all I needed to know." He didn't tell Grace right away. He meant to. But then he watched her that evening, tying her hair up with a strip of ribbon she'd found in Jenna's old sewing box, smiling faintly when the soup turned out just right. And he couldn't bring himself to drop the weight on her shoulders. Not yet. Instead, he locked the back door for the first time in weeks and moved his tools inside. She noticed. "You okay?" she asked softly as he brought the snow shovel in from the porch and leaned it against the wall. "Storm's picking up again," he said. She didn't press, but her eyes lingered too long. She felt it. The air had changed. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The fire had burned low. The house was quiet, but something gnawed at him. Some instinct from his years as a firefighter, or maybe just as a father. He got up, padded barefoot to the window and looked out. That's when he saw it. A trail, of footprints not from him, not from her. Too wide apart, too heavy, fresh. They circled the back of the house, disappeared into the trees. Thomas's pulse thundered in his ears. He didn't turn on the lights, didn't open the door. He just stood there, watching the snow fall softly over those prints, trying as always to cover the world's cruelty in silence and white. Morning brought a tense quiet. Grace noticed the drawn blinds, the extra log in the fire, the way Thomas kept glancing out the window as he stirred his coffee. She didn't ask, but she knew. When she returned from the bathroom, she found her backpack placed beside the couch. Inside was a thermos, a scarf, a wrapped sandwich, a flashlight. Thomas stood near the hearth. "Just in case," he said. Her face crumpled, not in fear, but in recognition. "He's here, isn't he?" Thomas didn't answer. She sat down slowly, the old backpack resting in her lap like a wound, reopened. "I knew he'd come eventually," she whispered. Thomas sat across from her. "You don't have to go," he said. "Not unless you choose to." Her voice was thin. "He doesn't care what I choose." "Then it's not up to him." She looked at him then, and in her face was a storm he hadn't yet seen. Anger, shame, fear twisted into years of silence. "He's not just some guy," she said. He's my mother's husband, not my father. Never was." Thomas swallowed. "Did your mother know?" "She didn't believe me," Grace said. "Said I was trying to ruin her marriage. Said girls like me bring trouble." Her hands trembled. "He's not here for me," she added. "He's here for control, for the story, to say he cleaned up the mess." Thomas leaned forward. "You're not a mess," he said quietly. "You're a girl who survived." She blinked and for a moment looked like a child again. "I don't want to run anymore," she whispered. Thomas nodded. "Then don't." That evening, Thomas found himself in the old workroom, the one that still smelled of sawdust and varnish and the memory of Jenna's hands brushing past his elbow. He reached for a length of cedar and began carving without blueprint or plan, just hands and instinct. By nightfall, he had shaped something small, a cradle. Not complete, but started. He sanded the edges smooth, then placed it in the corner of the living room, beside the fire. Grace saw it the next morning. She didn't say a word, but her hand hovered over the curved rail, her fingers lightly touching the wood like it might vanish if she pressed too hard. Thomas sipped his coffee. Eyes on the window. "There's a storm coming," he said. Grace nodded. "I know." This time she didn't look scared. This time she looked ready. The knock came just after dusk. Not soft this time, not hesitant. A sharp, demanding rap, rap, rap that cut through the last breath of twilight like a blade. Thomas had been expecting it. He'd been sitting by the fire, boots laced, coat nearby, his shoulders squared, his jaw set. Grace froze in the kitchen, halfway through drying a bowl. The cloth slipped from her hand, landing soundlessly on the floor. She looked at him. Pale still, Thomas stood slowly. "You stay here," he said. She didn't argue. But as he turned toward the door, he felt her move, silent steps across the floor, until she stood behind him, no more than an arm's reach away. He opened the door. The man on the porch didn't look like a monster. That's the thing about them. They rarely do. He was dressed clean. Expensive coat, leather gloves, eyes like frostbite. Cold, colorless with a glint that didn't blink. Well, well, the man said, smiling. Took you long enough. Thomas didn't smile back. You're trespassing, he said flatly. The man tilted his head. I'm here for someone, not you. From behind, Grace let out a tiny breath. Thomas heard it, felt it, like a pin, dropped inside a cathedral. You should leave, Thomas said. She's my responsibility, the man replied smoothly. She belongs with her family. Thomas stepped forward, blocking the door fully now. You had your chance at that. She chose otherwise. The man's smile faltered. She's pregnant, he said, voice low, like a threat. 16, vulnerable. What kind of judge do you think would side with an old man playing hero in the woods? Thomas's eyes didn't waver. The kind that listens. The man's gaze flicked past him toward the hallway behind. You don't know what she's capable of. She lies, manipulates. She cries, and people listen, and suddenly you're the bad guy. No, Thomas said, voice steady. You did that part on your own. The wind picked up around them, howling along the porch rail. The apple tree creaked in the distance, its bare limbs black against the sky. I won't ask again, the man said, now teeth clenched. She's coming with me. Thomas didn't move. You set 1 foot over that threshold, he said, and I'll make sure the sheriff hears exactly what Grace told me, what your record might start to look like. You won't touch her. Not now, not ever. A muscle twitched in the man's jaw. For a moment, Thomas thought he might lunge, but then he saw something flicker in his eyes. Not defeat. Fear. You don't scare me, the man spat. Thomas leaned forward, voice low and final. I don't need to scare you. I just need to outlast you. The man took a step back. Another. Then, with a last glare past Thomas's shoulder, he turned and disappeared into the night, his boots crunching a bitter trail through the snow. Thomas stood in the doorway a moment longer, listening. When the sound of footsteps faded, he closed the door slowly, locking the bolt with a soft click. Behind him, Grace was shaking. He turned to her, unsure what to say, but she stepped forward without hesitation and wrapped her arms around him. It wasn't a timid hug. It was desperate, her face pressed into his chest. Her hands gripped his back like she thought he might vanish if she let go. He stood there stunned. Then slowly, carefully, he closed his arms around her. The top of her head barely reached his chin. Her shoulders were thin, but the sobs that escaped her were deep, guttural. Years' worth of silence finally breaking open. I was so scared, she whispered. I thought if he found me. You're safe now, Thomas murmured. I've got you. She pulled back just far enough to look up at him. Her eyes were red, raw, but clear. Her lips trembled as she spoke. I didn't think I'd ever call anyone this. I didn't think I was allowed. He blinked. Then she whispered, voice breaking in two. Thank you, Dad. Thomas didn't answer. Couldn't. His throat was a knot of fire and snow and something too big to name. He only held her tighter, and in that moment, on a winter night beside a wood stove in a cabin buried in quiet, a stranger became a daughter, and a man who thought he'd lost everything became a father again. The fire started just before dawn. Thomas woke to smoke, not thick, not choking, but wrong. It slipped under the bedroom door like a whisper he thought he'd never hear again. He was on his feet in seconds, lungs already tightening with memory. Not again. He threw open the door, heart pounding. The living room glowed too brightly, orange flickers dancing along the walls. Heat curled from the corner of the kitchen. Sparks spat from behind the stove, where old wiring and dry timber had conspired in silence. Grace, he shouted, already moving. Grace! She stumbled from the hallway, coughing, her flannel sleeve pulled over her mouth, her eyes wide. Behind her, smoke pooled like water in a sinking ship. Thomas grabbed her hand. We get out. Now. But her eyes flew to the wooden box by the hearth. The letters. I've got it. He didn't hesitate. One arm around her shoulders, the other reaching for the box. Heavy, warm, full of a history that didn't belong in flames. The cradle, unfinished, already caught. Outside, snow, air, light. They burst through the front door into bitter cold and sudden silence. Thomas turned just in time to see the windows bloom with fire, like the cabin had inhaled its last breath and exhaled everything it had loved. Grace dropped to her knees in the snow, the wooden box clutched to her chest. Thomas stood behind her, eyes locked on the blaze. It wasn't a roaring fire, and not yet, but it was hungry. And it was enough. It was taking the home they'd built, the safety they had begun to believe in. I left the cradle, Grace said between sobs. It was for her. You made it for her. Thomas knelt beside her, resting a hand on her back. She doesn't need a cradle, he said softly. She needs a mother who'll keep going, and she's got one. They sat like that for a long time, snow melting into their sleeves, the fire painting the sky with gold and grief. By midday, the cabin was a skeleton, black beams, twisted pipes, a roof that sagged like it had been praying when the flames took it. Thomas stood beside the sheriff and 2 volunteers from the fire crew, watching steam curl from the embers. Faulty wiring, most likely, Sheriff Brandt said. Old kitchens will do that. Thomas nodded. He didn't speak. Brandt glanced at Grace, who stood a few paces away, wrapped in a blanket, still cradling the letterbox like a newborn. You two got somewhere to go? Thomas hesitated. Then, Well, that night they stayed in the church basement, fold-out cots, quiet heaters, a bowl of soup from Mrs. Langley that tasted better than it should have. Grace didn't say much. Thomas didn't either. He sat beside her cot, both of them listening to the hum of pipes overhead. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry. We'll rebuild, he said softly. Grace looked over. The house? He shook his head. Us. In the morning, Thomas stepped out into the sharp, clean air. A thin crust of snow sparkled across the sidewalks. A few townsfolk passed, nodding gently, not asking questions. He walked to the ruins, not to sift, not to salvage, just to stand. The tree was still there. Ellie's promise tree, charred at one edge but upright, stubborn. He placed his palm against its trunk, feeling the cold. The bark cracked beneath his hand, not a wound but a history. I'm still here, he whispered. Behind him, footsteps. Grace. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him, eyes on what used to be the front porch. I should be used to it, she murmured. Don't ever get used to loss, Thomas said. It deserves more than that. She nodded, then opened the box. From it, she pulled a folded sheet. Not one of Ellie's, one of hers. I was writing this before the fire, she said. I wasn't sure I'd ever put it in. She handed it to him. He read slowly. Dear Hope, today everything burned. Not just the house, the cradle, the pictures, but the part of me that thought I couldn't survive it. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I stood still, and someone stood beside me. And now I know. The opposite of fear isn't courage. It's belonging, and we are still here. Love, Mom. Thomas looked at her. You're still writing. I have to, she said. It's the only way I know how to carry things. He placed the letter back in the box. We'll make new things, he said. Whatever we need. She smiled, weak but real. Even a cradle? He grinned. Especially a cradle. That night the town held a potluck in the church hall. Nothing fancy, just crockpots, string lights, and neighbors passing bread and casseroles like currency. Someone handed Thomas a flannel shirt. Someone else offered him keys to a cabin they weren't using until spring. No speeches, No pity, just community. Grace sat near the fire with Mrs. Langley, sipping cider. Thomas watched her laugh. Not loudly, not carelessly, but without fear. And in the glow of borrowed candles, surrounded by warmth that had nothing to do with fire, he realized something. They hadn't lost everything, not even close. Spring came, slow to Pine Hollow. The snow didn't melt so much as loosen its grip, a quiet surrender. Patches of earth reappeared like forgotten promises. Trees began to stretch again, their limbs aching toward light. Thomas hadn't been to the cabin site in nearly 3 weeks. After the fire, after the nights spent on borrowed cots and hand-me-down couches, he'd expected Grace to say she was ready to go, that she'd outgrown whatever fragile piece they'd managed to piece together, but she didn't. She stayed, and so did he. Then, one Sunday morning, something changed. It started with a knock, not the kind that carried threats or questions and why, but a gentle, neighborly rhythm, one Thomas hadn't heard in years. He opened the door of the borrowed cabin and found Sheriff Brandt standing there, a thermos in one hand, a clipboard in the other. Figured it was time, Brandt said. Got some folks who want to help. Help with what? Thomas asked, though he already knew. Raising what was lost. By the following weekend, the clearing where their home had once stood was buzzing with life. Hank, the town's retired carpenter, showed up at dawn with a truckload of salvaged timber in hands that still remembered how to shape wood into shelter. Don't need blueprints, he grumbled. Just heart. The Granger twins brought shingles. The Anderson kids made sandwiches. Mrs. Langley handed out lemonade in old mason jars, pressing them into calloused palms with the same tenderness she used for scripture. Even old man Rourke came, and he hadn't left his porch since his wife passed 2 winters ago. Thomas watched them come one by one, each carrying something, a hammer, a tarp, a nail gun, a story. No one asked for anything in return. Grace stood beside him that morning, arms crossed, eyes wet. I didn't know people could be this kind, she said softly. They don't always get the chance to show it, Thomas replied. They started with the foundation, not just the concrete, but the moments. Hank drew lines in the dirt while Grace knelt nearby, placing small stones where she wanted the garden to be. Thomas marked where the front door would stand. Grace etched a heart in the frame with a pencil when no one was looking. By dusk, a frame had risen. Not a house yet, but the shape of one. And Thomas, standing there with sawdust on his sleeves and sweat drying on his neck, felt something he hadn't dared feel in a long time. Not just hope, pride. The next day, Grace painted the front porch steps. She chose blue, Ellie's favorite color, she said. Thomas swallowed, nodded. Good memory. Later, he found her in the new living room, still just studs and open beams, sketching the layout in her notebook. You making plans? He asked. She looked up, grinning. I want the baby to have a corner with sunlight. For books. For dreaming. Thomas sat beside her on the floor. You think she'll like it here? Grace paused. Then, I think she'll call it home. When the roof went up, someone brought a banner. Welcome back home, it read, painted in crooked, childlike letters. Thomas stood beside Grace and the others, looking up at the beams, and felt a strange tightness in his throat. I used to think I wasn't meant to have this again, he admitted. Grace looked at him. And now? He smiled. I think I just wasn't meant to have it alone. By the time the walls were closed in, Grace had begun to show. Not much, just a curve. Just enough for Mrs. Langley to rest her hand on it and say, strong heartbeat. In there I can feel it. Grace blushed. Thomas grinned. They painted the nursery together, pale green. Grace chose it because it reminded her of morning light. Thomas built the shelves by hand. He carved her name into the cradle's headboard, the same design, the same curve. But this time, he added a second name beneath it. Hope. On the last day of construction, Grace stood in the new kitchen, hands resting on the countertop that still smelled like fresh pine and linseed oil. Thomas handed her the box of letters. Still want this by the fire? He asked. Grace smiled. Always, she placed it gently on the hearthstone, a small wooden altar not to loss but to memory. They stood there a moment, silent. Then Grace turned to him. "There's something I've been meaning to ask." He raised an eyebrow. "All right." She hesitated, then said, almost too quietly, "Do you want to be in the delivery room?" Thomas didn't speak. Didn't need to. He just reached for her hand and held it. That night, the town gathered outside the new house. There was cider and laughter, and candles lit along the steps. A radio played something soft. The stars blinked through a thinning veil of clouds. Thomas looked around. Grace, seated on the steps with a blanket around her shoulders. Neighbors leaning on rails, telling old stories. The promise tree still stood at the edge of the yard, and now, beside it, a new sapling, growing slowly but strong. It had been almost a year. The seasons had turned, one careful page at a time, until spring gave way to full summer. Sunlight warming the porch railings, birdsong drifting through open windows, and the scent of sawdust long since replaced by cinnamon and lavender and the faint sweetness of baby lotion. Thomas stood at the edge of the backyard, coffee mug in hand, watching Grace through the kitchen window. She was singing, softly to herself, while swaying with the baby tucked against her chest. Hope. 8 weeks old, with fists that curled like question marks and eyes that didn't miss a thing. She had Grace's nose. But when she blinked up at Thomas, something in him swore she held Ellie's old soul. Inside the house, Maisie from next door sat at the kitchen table, drawing with crayons and asking 100 questions. Grace answered them all with the kind of patience Thomas had only ever seen in people who knew what it meant to be silenced. He'd never thought he'd see this again. Life unfolding in his home. Laughter layered over routine. Someone humming while folding laundry. He stepped back inside. The front door no longer creaked. Grace had oiled the hinges herself. He paused at the hearth, where the box of letters still sat, now heavier. Some from Ellie, some from Grace, some she was already writing to Hope. He reached in and pulled one from the top. It was addressed not to Hope this time, but to him. "Dear Thomas, I've been writing letters all my life, but this is the first time I'm writing one to say thank you. Thank you for opening the door. Thank you for standing between me and the cold. Not just outside, but the kind that had grown inside me. Thank you for never asking me to be anything but myself, even when I didn't know who that was. You didn't just give me shelter. You gave me a second chance to be loved, to belong. You made room. You stayed. And I want you to know, whatever she grows up calling you, I already call you Dad. With all my heart, Grace." Thomas sat down, letter trembling in his hand. He didn't cry. Not exactly. He just let the warmth take him, that rare, impossible feeling of being exactly where you're meant to be after years of drifting. That evening, they had dinner on the porch. Hope slept in a cradle Thomas had built from leftover wood, smooth as river stone. Grace had painted it sage green to match the nursery walls. Maisie braided dandelions into crowns and placed one solemnly on Hope's head. "She's a queen now," Maisie declared. "Always was," Grace whispered. Thomas grilled salmon. Burned it slightly. No one complained. After dinner they walked to the edge of the yard where the promise tree still stood, and beside it, the sapling they'd planted in winter. It had leaves now. Not many, but enough. Thomas knelt beside it, brushing the dirt from the base. "She's growing," he said. Grace joined him. "She's not the only one." As the sky darkened and fireflies blinked into being, Grace took Hope into the house. Thomas lingered under the trees. The wind moved softly through the branches, a hush of memory and time. He looked up at the promise tree. "I kept it," he whispered. "The promise." He didn't expect a reply. But just then, the wind shifted, and a single apple, not large, not ripe, dropped from the upper branches and landed at his feet. He chuckled under his breath, picking it up. "All right," he said. "Message received." Inside, the house had settled into its evening hush, the kind that only comes when everyone under the roof has found their place. Thomas sat by the hearth. Grace handed him a fresh letter, this one blank on the outside. "I wrote it for when she's older," she said, "but you can read it now." He unfolded the page. "Dear Hope, you were born in fire and rebuilt in laughter. You came into a world that wasn't ready, but found arms that made room. You are not the product of what hurt me. You are what healed me. This is your home, not because of walls or wood, but because people stayed when they didn't have to. People chose you, and that means you get to choose too. Love." Mom. Thomas folded the letter slowly. He looked up at Grace, who now stood with Hope asleep in her arms, swaying gently in the golden light. She met his eyes. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. He walked over, placed a hand on Hope's back, and leaned in close. "I love you," he whispered. To the baby, to the girl, to the quiet, to all the lives he'd been given the chance to protect. Later that night, Thomas sat by the fire while Grace dozed in the rocking chair. Hope curled on her chest. Maisie had left a new note in the box. "Dear Hope, I think we're the luckiest kids ever. Some people never find home. We gotta grow up in one. Not perfect, but real. I hope when we're older we live on the same street, or even the same house. I hope we still build snow forts and eat pancakes and write silly letters. Love, your sister cousin, Maisie." Thomas placed it gently with the others, then added another log to the fire. The room glowed, not brightly, but enough, because sometimes the loudest miracles aren't loud at all. They arrive on tired feet, through open doors, and in the voice of a girl who one day says, "Thank you, Dad." If this story left something warm in your chest, a memory, a hope, or even a quiet tear, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Sometimes all it takes is one story to remind us we're not alone.